네. Wait. Wait. Okay. Good boy. Treats. Good boy. Treats.
Arlo and Greta have been working on the wait command. It's a hard one for a dog, teaching them that only patience is going to get them what they want. And jumping the gun, well, it gets them nowhere. I wonder if you remember that one of the fruits of the Spirit we started to talk about last week is patience. Arlo doesn't have much. I think all of us are starting to find it really, really hard to wait. How many of you know this Dr. Seuss book? It's a book a lot of kids get when they graduate because it begins. Congratulations. Here's our main character. In the beginning, headed toward the future, it says you can steer yourself any direction you choose. Even when he approaches strange streets and new places, he keeps moving forward. He says we can get hung up or we can get in a slump, but he keeps moving forward until, that is, he arrives at the waiting place. Here's the waiting place. In the waiting place, it appears that nothing is happening. Look, everyone's just waiting. What are they waiting for? Well, it says they're waiting for a train to go, or a bus to come, or a plane to go, or the mail to come, the phone to ring, the snow to snow, or waiting around for a yes or no, or waiting for their hair to grow, waiting for the fish to bite, or waiting for wind to fly a kite, or waiting around for Friday night, or waiting perhaps for their Uncle Jake, or a pot to boil, or a better break, or a string of pearls, or a pair of pants, or a wig with curls, or another chance. Everyone is just waiting. The waiting place. It feels a lot like where we are now, just waiting for life to return to normal. Of course, the story doesn't end here. The story continues. Somehow you'll escape all that waiting and staging. You'll find the bright places where the boom bands are playing. And interestingly, the last page begins the same as the beginning, because we will move forward again. But right now, you and I and most of the world are all here in this waiting place. Even though we're waiting, we're still moving and growing. And you know who else is here in the waiting place? God is with you in the waiting place. Think of it this way. God is in your pod. Knowing that, I wonder if it's easier to relax in this space, to trust that God is with you, to rely on God to help you stay here in the waiting place a while longer, to be aware of the Holy Spirit working in you while you're waiting, showing you new possibilities and ways of being that I think sometimes we can only learn and experience when we're forced to be patient and to wait. And when we leave and move forward again, which we will, we may have a chance to be better, more faithful, kinder, and wiser people because of the time that we've spent here in the waiting place with God in our pod. See y'all next week. Bye.
There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace.
One of my favorite memories from my adolescence was from a teen leadership program I attended my sophomore year in high school. I was one of very few representatives from my school. All of us who enrolled in the weekend retreat came from schools all over the state. From Friday evening to Sunday afternoon, a Boy Scout camp deep in the woods of Peterborough, New Hampshire became ground zero for a community of youth. Think of our youth program, WCG, but over 100 strong and with matching t-shirts. Truth be told, I was a little nervous about this weekend. I'm a shy person at heart, so while I was curious about what we would do and learn together, I wasn't sure about spending so much time away from home with all these strangers. But it wasn't long after I arrived, sleeping bag in hand, that I began to relax. For over dinner, I made a new acquaintance, a girl my age named Jen, from a high school about a 20-minute drive from my town. Like me, she had intentionally weird hair. It was the 80s after all. We listened to the same bands from England, also with intentionally weird hair. One of those rare experiences where you feel an instant understanding and comfort with a stranger. In Jen's company, I went very quickly from feeling lost in the crowd to someone who belonged. As fate would have it, Jen and I were assigned to the same sleeping cabin. This gave us the opportunity to continue our conversation after dinner, and then while the other girls got ready for bed and crawled into their bunks. Someone called lights out, so we lowered our voices, but in adjoining bunks, Jen and I kept talking. Nestled in the New Hampshire woods, the dark night surrounded the cabin. Night was deeper than at home. Jen and I talked, not seeing each other or anything else for that matter. To this day, I cannot remember one thing that Jen and I talked about at the New Hampshire Teen Institute retreat, but I do remember the long arc of that night. How my conversation partner evolved from a faceless voice in the dark to seeing the faint outline of her nose once the night began to give way to dawn. With each minute that went by, her face became more and more into focus. When I think back, this epic conversation was the thread that held it all together. The deep night, the faint gray lines, the growing light, the utter lack of sleep. From Friday night to Saturday morning, together Jen and I traveled through liminal space, from the certainty of nighttime to the certainty of the risen morning sun, with many increments of gray in between. Echoing this natural evolution from Friday to Saturday, Jen and I began as engaged acquaintances and arrived in the morning in a different relationship, as friends. Jen and I are still friends today, albeit in that Facebook friend sort of way. And while I miss the intensity of our initial connection, I will always remember with gratitude the unexpected gift of us becoming part of each other's lives at the retreat. Her friendship was worth the sacrifice of a night's sleep. I tell this story this morning as I've been thinking a lot about liminal space. As Richard Rohr affirms in our centering thought, to consider liminal space is to consider the tension between one space and another, and the dramatic change that can happen in between, from night to morning light, from stranger to friend. These poles of experience are definitive, but at the heart of today's message is the reminder that we are wise to remember that what happens in the middle can be confusing and painful, but also powerful and transformative. We'd be wise to consider sacred liminality. Liminal space is woven into the rhythms of human life. Defined points of time throughout a given day, sunrise, noon, sunset punctuate liminality. The earth-based religions invite us to pay attention to the places in between, the seasonal equinoxes when night and day are in complete balance, such as the coming of autumn this Tuesday. Weddings are the culmination of so much growth in liminality. The new relationship between partners and between their families does not begin with the ceremony, but with the engagement. The wedding is a public declaration of invitations extended between families and promises already made between lovers. And if you ever had a loved one enter hospice care, you know that there is life and there is death and a powerful sacred space in between where people and their beloveds dwell together, sometimes for days, sometimes for months. While we often turn our attention to the points and places that are known and understood, so much of our lives unfolds in between. My thinking about liminal space was inspired by a book I read this summer by renowned congregational consultant Susan Beaumont, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. Beaumont wrote her book in response to the cultural changes fostering the dramatic decline of congregations in the United States. As we've entered into long-term pandemic ministry, as we approach a high consequence election, a time when so many things are up in the air, the title spoke to me in other ways. Throughout this year, I will touch on Beaumont's ideas in worship as together we are between the known world before last March and on our way somewhere else, the destination and the path uncertain. When I use the phrase congregational consultant, you may think of someone with a snappy pantsuit, fluent in PowerPoint with acronyms and formulas to plan staffing patterns or parking lot sizes. Perhaps Susan Beaumont has some of these qualities, but one thing I appreciate about her leadership is her approach. Beaumont writes in her preface that in her work, she has come to see not the congregation's leaders as her client, but the congregation itself, the institution. In this way, she approaches the institution of congregation with the questions a caring pastor might ask a person. Who were you when you were young? Who are you now? What habits no longer serve you? Where are you called to invest your energies in this time? Beaumont does not approach congregational leaders with a bag of tricks or formulas from a place of spiritual inquiry. Susie Beaumont is Christian and often consults with Christian communities, so I was not surprised when exploring the meaning of liminal space. She turned to Jewish and Christian teachings for examples. Perhaps one of the most familiar narratives illustrating liminal space is the Exodus story, the account of Moses leading his people out of slavery. While the Israelites did reach the promised land, the path was not direct, and the promise of milk and honey eluded them throughout the 40 years of their wandering. Even though they were liberated from the cruel bondage of Pharaoh, the people complained. Perhaps Virginia Satir said it best. Most people prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. Living in liminal space is often frightening, painful, and uncomfortable. And perhaps this suffering is an important part of the story. While the Israelites could have embraced their freedom at the moment of their physical deliverance from Pharaoh's power, it took time, 40 years of desert wandering, for people to become spiritually free. The Jewish people are not the only ones to learn this lesson. Slavery has been illegal in the United States for more than 150 years. Yet many would say that our nation's soul, and the souls of both those who perpetrate and suffer at the hands of systemic racism, are not yet free. Together, we dwell in a painful place of liminality, beyond slavery, but not yet at true equality. But the Exodus story is not the only source of inspiration when considering sacred liminality. One reason I am a Unitarian Universalist is we have the freedom to embrace wisdom from many places, from the book of Exodus to scientific journals, to poems and newspaper articles. One modern source of wisdom is podcasts. As I prepared for the sermon, I unexpectedly heard 2 different podcasts that offered important lessons. One was a familiar program, This American Life. In a recent episode, they explore a movie from the 1960s. What's so bad about feeling good? One thing they make clear is that as a film, it is pretty terrible. But as a way to consider the times we are currently living through, it offers some intriguing insight. What's so bad about feeling good centers on two misanthropes, Pete and Liz, living in the gritty world of New York City. A loose tropical bird infects city dwellers with a novel virus. While the virus causes a number of symptoms, the disease is never fatal. And the primary symptom is euphoria, causing the hostile and depressed citizenry of Manhattan to become optimistic and joyful. The main characters both become infected and fall in love with one another. So what is so bad about feeling good? As people embrace this new lease on life, they stop drinking and smoking, threatening the tax income to the city. Officials worked fast, even faster than biomedical companies now, to create a vaccine, lest the city become bankrupt from widespread happiness. The idea of government officials toying with human health for economic gain is shocking, I know. Once they make a vaccine, they spread it through the air, so those who were once sick with happiness then become well again. Yet of our two protagonists, Pete returns to his old grumpy ways, while Liz remains joyful. She temporarily transcended her perspective on the world between infection and cure, and was thus forever changed. She now sees what is possible in human life. Liz transformed herself in a time of liminality. And there was an even more powerful story on Radiolab. If you haven't heard Radiolab, it's a program exploring the great curiosities in the world through the lens of science. In their recent episode, Dispatches from 1918, they explore accounts from the great influenza pandemic of that time. While the coronavirus pandemic has been challenging for so many, I at least console myself that unlike the influenza pandemic, we are not simultaneously engaged in a world war. I thank WISP member Harris Gibson for encouraging me to also read The Great Influenza by John Barry. Through Barry's book, I learned that facing pressure from national leaders, newspapers consciously decided to not write about the influenza pandemic, lest this news erode morale for the armed conflict. The idea of the media gaslighting a nation for political purposes is shocking, I know. Yet the simultaneous challenges of the war and the pandemic did impact one another. Radiolab invites us to consider the Treaty of Versailles, the formal conclusion of the war.
Two world leaders working on the treaty were French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. These two men, both significant leaders of the process, were at stark odds with one another at the treaty table. Clemenceau sought to punish Germany for its aggression against France, while Wilson had a more merciful vision, one that sought to convene a League of Nations to mediate international conflicts to prevent future wars. Their positions were intractable. Then Wilson became seriously ill. The disease came on so suddenly his staff first thought he was poisoned. His symptoms, including delirium, made it clear he contracted influenza. Wilson eventually recovered, but returned to the treaty talks a different man. His fight for a merciful and measured conclusion to the war went out of him. While the treaty did lead to Wilson's League of Nations, the remaining terms reflected Clemenceau's punitive aims. As one observed, the treaty essentially made Germany cease to exist. In retrospect, some wonder if Wilson's surrendering of will, likely due to his brush with death, was the turning point for the treaty's terms that set the stage for the Second World War, a war including the Holocaust and Hiroshima, the destruction of cities and the deaths of millions of people. But Wilson was not the only leader impacted by influenza. In India, a lawyer and community organizer named Mohandas Gandhi encouraged his countrymen to aid the British during the war, believing that India's support would inspire Britain to grant India greater autonomy. Gandhi was not always a devout proponent of nonviolence. It was the Indian soldiers returning home that brought influenza to the country. Soon, thousands, including Gandhi, were afflicted. Gandhi wrote to his son throughout the months of his medical odyssey, It was clear that Gandhi believed he was dying. "I have a feeling that I am now going," he writes. "I have very little time left. The body is becoming weaker and weaker." This reckoning with his life and his death sparked spiritual reflection, also revealed in his messages. "But my heart is at peace, so I do not find the going at all difficult. I think whatever inheritance I am leaving to you, brothers, is appropriate. What would you have gained if I had left money? But the inheritance of character which I am leaving to you is invaluable in my view. I wish you to cherish it, follow the path of religion." Gandhi believed that illness was punishment from God for wrongdoing. As he recovered, he concluded that his advocacy for entering World War I was his moral failure. Thus, his commitment to nonviolence became more resolute. And as he observed Britain's abandonment of the Indian people as millions suffered and died from influenza, the calling towards seeking home rule became clear.
These stories, lifted up by Radiolab, offer significant lessons. Two world leaders changed dramatically through the crucible of their illness. With Wilson, the physical impact of the disease weakened his drive to advance his convictions. With the other, Gandhi, the disease fostered and strengthened his beliefs, planting the seeds for his leadership of a transformative, non-violent revolution. None of us is a world leader like Gandhi or Woodrow Wilson, and yet we would be wise to become more aware of how our collective reckoning with life, mortality, and social isolation are changing us right now. This is not a new idea. Many have given names to this chapter of quarantine, a time out, a forced retreat. We have asked and we've been asked how we want to change in this time and how we want to merge. So this morning, I just wish to take this observation one step further. I invite us to recognize the painful moments of liminal space, our complaints as we wander this desert, and perhaps understand them a little differently. If you are like me, you have hit an emotional wall recently with the pandemic and fear about our collective political future and the seemingly endless stream of bad news. As always, the preacher preaches what they most need to hear. Frustration and anger and fear and grief may be signs that something significant is happening. On the surface, these may be emotions reacting to everyday life, but like a child moving from one developmental milestone to the next, our adult tantrums may be signs of profound growth. And as the accounts of Wilson and Gandhi remind us, we can change profoundly, and there can be significant impacts from a transformed self, sometimes shaping the trajectory of world events, sometimes leading to the death of millions or the birth of freedom. We'd be wise to honor the power of what can happen in liminal space. I imagine I'm not alone in reading articles about the pandemic. Sometimes when I'm most uncomfortable with how long and difficult and open-ended this time is, I search for knowledgeable predictions of when and how this painful time in between infection and treatment or vaccine will end. A recent article suggested that we may not have a viable vaccine until spring. But then there is distribution of the vaccine and the time it takes for the vast majority of the population to become immune, and the vaccines may not be effective or long-lasting. So returning to anything like life as we remember it is still a long way off. To use the metaphor of nighttime, we cannot see any gray shapes in the dark. The dawn is still hours away. So let us then remember, let us remind one another that we can grow in the nighttime, in times in between. And let us remember that we can grow and change in powerful ways, and powerfully change people, change the world in which they live. We may not see this now. We may not be seeing much of anything clearly, but we can rest in the understanding of the ancients that something is happening, hopefully something that will serve us and serve others in ways that we cannot even imagine.
We return to God a portion of what has been given to us for God's work in our shared ministry. Friends and members are asked to prayerfully consider giving in support of Crawford's ministries and operations. You can give electronically by clicking the button in the weekly messenger or on our website, or mail a check to 34 Dick Street, Winchester, Mass. 01890. And now you can also text Crawford UMC to 44321. Thank you.
Your love unites us, your word delights us, your peace reminds us we are ever in your tender care. Your love surrounds us, your work astounds us. We are your church, O God, and you have made us one. Lord, we adore you, we bow before you. Lord, we implore you as we gather in your holy name. Come, Spirit, teach us, with grace now lead us. We are your church, O God, and you have made us one. We are one voice, one hallelujah. We are one song of praise forever in God's praise. We are one people, we are one hymn of faith. We are one church in love's embrace. Lord, we are grateful, we will be faithful, and by your grace fulfill our destiny of truth and life. Lord, you are holy, we serve you only. We are your church, O God, and you have made us one. We are your church, O God. We are your church. We are one.
This is the way the rhythm moves. The fall of the year comes, then winter with its trees stripped of leaf and bud, cold winds ruthless in bitterness and sting. One day there is sleet and ice. In the silence of the nighttime, the snow falls soundlessly. All this until at last the cold seems endless, and all there is seems to be shadowy and foreboding. The earth is weary and heavy. Then something stirs. A strange new vitality pulses through everything. One can feel the pressure of some vast energy pushing, always pushing through dead branches, slumbering roots. Life surges everywhere within and without. Spring has come. The day usurps the night view. Is there any wonder that deeper than idea and concept is the insistent conviction that the night can never stay, that winter is ever moving toward the spring? Thus, when a man sees the lights go out one by one, When he sees the end of his days marked by death, his death, he senses rather than knows that even the night into which he is entering will be followed by day. It remains for religion to give this ancient wisdom phrase and symbol. For millions of men and women in many climes, this phrase and this symbol are forever one with Jesus, the prophet from Galilee. When the preacher says, as a part of the last rites, "I am the resurrection and the life," he is reminding us all of the ancient wisdom. Upon the night view of the world, a day view must follow.